In 2023, it will be 5 years since the 18th edition was first published back in July 2018. So today I'm going to recap on some of the changes that have happened since 2018 up to the end of 2022. So fortunately, Amendment 2 of the 18th edition, which I've got a copy in front of me here, includes an introduction to the 18th edition on page 4, which goes through the changes that happened back in 2018. And then on page 7, there is an introduction to Amendment 1 2020, and on page 8, there is an introduction to Amendment 2 2022. So this helps us to know when the changes came in. So if we turn to the introduction to the 18th edition and the amendments, we can see where the changes were made. Now, I'm sure you're familiar with what was introduced in the 18th edition 2018, so I'm going to look at the changes that have happened since then. In Amendment 1 of the 18th edition 2020, the changes were firstly to Part 2, definitions regarding Section 722. There was a new Section 700, which is an overarching section for Part 7 for special locations. However, the main changes were in Section 722 regarding electric vehicles. Now, if we look at the latest changes in Amendment 2 of the 18th edition, these are listed in the order of the chapters in the book. So what we can do is read through the list and then turn to the relevant chapter. And where there has been a change, you'll notice there's a line down the right-hand side of the page where the changes are. So this is really useful to find out where the changes are and what the changes mean. So if we have a look at the introduction to Amendment 2 2022 on page 8 of BSM DXM1, you can see that there's a list and it's in the order of the chapters in the regs book. So first of all, you'll notice Part 1, Scope, Object and Fundamental Principles, and then Part 2, Definitions. So the definitions have been updated, obviously, to take into account changes that have happened throughout the book. So you'll notice, for example, prosumers installations is now listed in the definitions. So you'll notice some changes in there, and again, you'll see that where you've got that black line down the right-hand side of the page. So the first chapter that we come up to is Chapter 41, Protection Against Electric Shock. And it says Section 411 contains a number of significant changes. Some of the main changes are mentioned below, and so it does summarise what the changes are in this introduction. So we've got Regulation 411.3.1.2, which has been redrafted. The regulation now requires that in each consumer's installation within a building, extraneous conductive parts that are liable to introduce a dangerous potential difference be connected to the main earthing terminal. A note has been added clarifying that where non-metallic pipes, e.g. plastic, enter the building and then connected to metallic pipes within the building, the metallic pipes within the building do not normally require protective bonding, as they are unlikely to be extraneous connected parts. References to insulating sections has been removed. Now, you may remember that that was something that came up previously. So that's just been clarified there. It's important to remember, though, that if you've got metal pipework and then that pipework then goes underground, it's likely to be extraneous. So I spoke in a previous video about the differences between extraneous and exposed conductive parts, and I'll put a link up at the top of the screen if you haven't seen that already. And then it goes on to Regulation 411.3.3, which has been redrafted. So let's have a look at Regulation 411.3.3 to show you what I mean when I say that we can find out where these changes are. So Regulation 411.3.3, and if we turn to page 65, so we can see Regulation 411.3.3, which relates to additional requirements for socket outlets and for the supply of mobile equipment for use outdoors. And so if you turn to that page, you'll see the black line down the side where the changes are. So that really helps to see where those changes are. So that's a really good example that you can see straight away there. And there's a few more changes in Chapter 41. One of them is Regulation 411.4.2, which now recommends an additional connection to earth by means of an earth electrode in accordance with Chapter 54. So this is something that I think has been discussed quite a lot since the book was introduced. Then we go on to Chapter 42, Protection Against Thermal Effects. Regulation 421.1.7 has been redrafted. It is now a requirement to protect final circuits supplying socket outlets with a rated current not exceeded 32 amps using arc fault detection devices, AFDDs. So this is probably the change that I think caused probably the most conversations about the changes in the wiring regulations. Obviously there was a lot of talk about AFDDs, and so this introduces the need for AFDDs in houses in multiple occupation, purpose-built student accommodation and care homes. So really important change, probably the biggest change that I think in Amendment 2 there. So it goes on, then regulation 422.1, precautions where particular risks of fire exist, now introduces requirement for the fire safety design of the building to be documented. And there's also regulation 422.2, which now introduces separate requirements for escape routes. Again, that was something that you may have heard discussed previously. So then we go on to chapter 44, protection against voltage disturbances and electromagnetic disturbances. So let's have a look at that, chapter 44. So regulation 443.4 is the one that comes up first. So there we go, chapter 44, regulation 443.4. So 443.4 is overvoltage control. Transient overvoltages due to the effects of indirect lightning strikes. And again, you'll notice the black line down the right hand side of the page. And you'll notice that it's not down the whole page. There are larger sections that have been changed, and you'll notice that there are some small lines in some places where there's been some small changes. So it's important to bear those in mind as well. So regulation 443.4 for determining if protection against transient overvoltages is needed has been redrafted. Regulation 443.4.1 now requires protection against transient overvoltages to be provided where the consequence caused by the overvoltage could result in serious injury to or loss of human life, failure of a safety service as defined in Part 2, and significant financial or data loss. For all other cases, protection against transient overvoltages shall be provided unless the owner of the installation declares that it's not required due to any loss or damage being tolerable. So this again is a really big change. You may remember that back in the 18th edition 2018, there was the introduction of the CRL calculation for determining whether surge protection is necessary. That's now gone. I actually think that's a really good thing. So it's much clearer now. Obviously, there's more requirement for surge protection now, but I think it's much clearer and much easier to understand when the SPDs are needed. So then we go on to section 514, which is identification and notices, and there's quite a few changes here. So section 514 contains a number of significant changes, including illustrations of notices which have now been removed, and examples are provided in Appendix 11. Table 51 has been modified slightly to take into account of changes of colour identification for DC, and abbreviations have been added. Regulation 514.9.1 now contains an exemption for domestic (household) premises. That is a change that you may remember. So another change in the wiring regulations is to regulation 531.3.3, which now states that RCD type AC shall only be used to serve fixed equipment where it is known that the load current contains no DC components. So this is a change, and I think you'll remember this one again. So basically we can only use the type AC RCD, which is the type with a little picture of a little sine wave on the front of it that you usually find in the split load board. We can only use those where there are no DC components. Now, again, this is something that I think that's going to be a topic of conversation when you're doing an EICR on a property that was installed to, say, the 18th edition or even the 17th edition. You're likely to find type AC RCDs, and so that begs the question, how will you code it on an EICR? Well, I think to answer that, and I was asked this question recently, to answer that question, I think the best way to look at it is if the observation relates to this new requirement in Amendment 2 of the 18th edition, then I would give it a code 3 because it's a new requirement and these aren't meant to be applied retrospectively. However, there are some examples of installations that required a different type of RCD previously, prior to Amendment 2. So, for example, PV installations, so solar PV installations, where the inverter has no basic separation between the AC and the DC side, that would have to be a type B RCD, and I think there are also requirements for electric vehicles, and those predated the Amendment 2 to the 18th edition. So it's important to bear in mind, if you find type AC RCDs in an installation and you're just trying to decide what code to give it, bear in mind what the observation relates to. But generally speaking though, if it relates to this new requirement, then you're going to be looking at a code 3, provided that the installation complies with the previous edition that it was designed to. So it's a case of, if an installation was designed to the 18th edition 2018 and it fully complies with that, it wouldn't necessarily be unsatisfactory. And there's a note at the beginning of pretty much every regs book that I can remember, and certainly at the beginning of Amendment 2 that explains this in detail, that it's not necessarily unsatisfactory if it complies with the previous edition. But obviously we do the testing to the current version, which means we still put down the observation, but obviously it's just a case of deciding what code that we give it. So just to go back on that, if you find a type AC RCD in an existing installation, such as in a split load board, for example, and that provides, say, socket outlet circuits or lighting circuits that have got LED lights, then you're going to be looking at a code 3. But obviously for any new installations that you do after the introduction of Amendment 2, then obviously we would need to be looking at using a type A RCD as a minimum for that. So that was a big change that happened, and I'm sure you probably all remember that. It's an important one to bear in mind when you're doing EICRs. So then we go on to Chapter 54, which regards earthing arrangements and protective conductors. So modifications have been made to Regulation Group 543.7 concerning earthing arrangements for the installation of equipment having high protective conductor currents. And then Regulation 544.1.1 concerning main protective bonding conductors has also been revised. Let's have a look at that, 544.1.1. 544.1.1. So this regards protective bonding conductors, main protective bonding conductors, and it says, except where PME conditions apply, a main protective bonding conductor shall have a cross-sectional area not less than half the cross-sectional area required for the earthing conductor for the installation. Where an installation serves more than one building, a main protective bonding conductor shall be selected in accordance with the characteristics of the distribution circuit protective conductor for that particular building. Now that is where the change is, and that's a subtle change that's happened there. So basically what that means is that if you've got a sub-main that runs from one building to another, you can size the protective bonding conductor in accordance with that sub-main rather than the incoming main. So that's a big change that might make a big difference there, except where PME conditions apply. So that's the key there. So this isn't regarding PME installations, this is regarding TNS installations. Then we go on to Chapter 55, Other Equipment. 551.7, additional requirements have been added for installations where the generating set or sets may operate in parallel with other sources, including systems for distribution of electricity to the public. Chapter 64, Initial Verification. Regulation Group 643.3 has been redrafted. The requirements for testing insulation resistance where equipment is likely to introduce the verification test or be damaged has been clarified, and reference is made to a 250 volt DC test following the connection of the equipment. Now this again is a big change. Now previously what we would do is we would test at 500 volts, but then if there was electronic equipment connected, we could reduce that to 250. So what it's now saying is that we do the 500 volt test before the equipment is connected, and then after the equipment is connected we can then carry out the 250 volt test. So really important to make sure that whenever we're doing installation resistance testing that we test all the conductors at 500 volts before any equipment is connected. So really important change there. There's also changes regarding the requirements for RCD testing. So that there was a table in Appendix 3 which has been deleted. And we can now use the test results for the test at 1 times the I delta N, and we don't have to do the 5 times I delta N. Of course we can carry out the test, but we don't have to record it on the test sheet, so that's a bit of an important change. Going forward, there were also some changes to Section 702, swimming pools and other basins. I believe there was also a change to 701. Doesn't seem to be listed here. That's really strange. That's really interesting. I'm sure that there was a change in Section 701 for rooms containing a bath or shower. If we look at Regulation 701.512.3, at the bottom we can see, except for self-socket outlets complying with Section 414 and shaver supply units complying with BSEN 61558-2-5, socket outlets are prohibited with a distance of 2.5 metres horizontally from the boundary of Zone 1. Now, this is Chapter 701, and I can't see Section 701 in this summary. So that I don't know why that is. I don't know if they made a... I don't know if there's been a bit of correction to this book since this was issued, to be fair, but just worth noting that I know that I said earlier in this video that we can refer to the list in this at the beginning of this book, but I've just noticed as I'm making this video there doesn't appear to be reference to that change in Section 701, which is the reduction of the distance from the boundary of Zone 1. It used to be 3 metres horizontally, it's now 2.5 metres. So that doesn't seem to be in there. Strange, I don't know why that is. If somebody knows, maybe please correct me, let me know in the comments if you know why that is. Maybe that wasn't a big enough change to warrant going in there, but it is a change nonetheless. And it may be, as I say, please correct me if I'm wrong, it may be that there was a correction to this book issued after I received this book. So going on from there was a change in 702, swimming pools and other basins. 703, rooms and cabins containing a sauna. Again, all of these you'll be able to refer to the section and look for the black line to see where the changes are. Construction sites and demolition sites. 706, conducting locations with restricted movement. Section 711, exhibition shows and stands. Section 712, solar voltaic PV power supply systems. Section 714, outdoor lighting installations. Section 717, mobile transportable units. And then Section 722, which I mentioned before, electric vehicle charging installations. Section 753, heating cables and embedded heated systems. And then we come on to Chapter 82, prosumers low voltage electrical installations, which is a new chapter in this book. I'm sure you'll be familiar with that from when it was introduced. It's something that was talked about quite a lot. Then there were some changes to the appendices. Again, I mentioned that one of the tables for RCDs was removed from Appendix 3. Some minor changes to Appendix 4. Now, Appendix 6 is somewhere where there's been change. Model forms for certification and reporting. So there's been some changes here. Minor changes have been made to the model forms and guidance for recipients. These include the addition of fields for recording the details of SPDs and AFDDs. A new example checklist of items requiring inspection during initial verification has been added to Appendix 6, but is not required to be provided with the certificate. And then now one of the interesting changes, there is now a single page generic schedule of test results used for EICE and EICR, and so there's separate pages for the schedule of test results and the schedule of circuits, schedule of circuit details. Appendix 7 was deleted by BS 7671 2018 Amendment 2. Appendix 11, warning and user instruction labels. Then we have Appendix 13, which is escape routes and fire protection. So there's been some changes there. Appendix 17, energy efficiency. This appendix includes changes to the scope to cover dwellings and reference to the building regulations, changes to user decisions, allow new design recommendations, new information on determining of meshes, new information on user requirement, new guidance covering impacts on the design of an installation, and new guidance on periodic assessment. So then we come to the end of the introduction to Amendment 2 2022. So as I say, quite interesting to look back over that and to see where the changes have happened, and you may find this really useful when you're carrying out an EICR. So just to recap, if you have a look at the introduction to Amendment 2, you'll see a brief summary, and then you can turn to the relevant chapter and you will see a black line down the right hand side of the page which will denote where the changes are. And some of them are quite big changes, and you'll see a big line, and some of them are quite subtle. And bear in mind that change for the bonding is quite a subtle change in the wording there, but makes a big change potentially if you've got a TNS system and you want to run a submain out to a building, and you need to be sizing the bonding for any extraneous connected parts that may be in that building. But again, the news that I wasn't expecting coming out of this video is that I couldn't see in this summary, anything relating to 701, which relates to rooms containing a bath or shower. There was only a slight change, obviously the reduction from 3 metres to 2.5 metres, but it is a change nonetheless. And I only noticed that because I remember the change happening from when it was introduced. So please correct me if I'm wrong. It may be that my version of the book has been corrected since I got this. Obviously I got this back in March, April, or whenever it was, so it may well have been corrected since then. I do notice that on the front of the book that we can see there's been a couple of corrigendums, as they call it, since 2018. But these summaries at the beginning of the book you may find useful. If you turn over to page 17, you'll notice the note by the Health and Safety Executive, which I mentioned earlier on in this video, and it says here, installations to which BS 7671 is relevant may have been designed and installed in accordance with an earlier edition, now superseded but then current. That in itself would not mean that the installation would fail to comply with the Electricity at Work Act 1989. So basically what that means and what it's telling us is that if you're doing an EICR and you're referencing this book, which is the current wiring regulations, if the installation complies with the previous version, say the 18th edition 2018 or even the 17th edition, it doesn't necessarily mean that that would be unsatisfactory, so it's important to bear that in mind. And so you may find this list of changes in the early part of this book useful in understanding where changes came in and when they happened. So I hope you found that useful. If so, please click over here to subscribe to my channel.